Do Americans really not care whether a candidate for president is a convicted felon? We'll dig into the numbers for you. You've heard your friends say both candidates are bad as justification for either not voting or voting for Trump. Will help you respond to the quote unquote double haters. Finally, we'll talk U.S. Supreme Court with law professor and author Joshua Douglas. Welcome back to the podcast for the 54% of Americans who regularly vote for progress in every election and want to convince their friends and family members to join a majority. This is Majority 54.
All right, Jason. Well, this is an interesting week because I think this is kind of the quiet before the storm. We're about to have the debates, the conventions, Trump's sentencing. Things are about to get hot. And I think it's a good time to step back and say, well, where does this race stand? And Politico had an interesting article where they basically asked the question, well, how are voters viewing Trump's conviction? And they found that among the voters that they polled, 21% of independents said the conviction made them less likely to support Trump, and it would be an important factor in their vote. So that cuts in one direction. Yet they found that a sizable percentage of folks either agreed strongly or somewhat agreed that the rationale for the case was political. And so it kind of cuts both ways. I have a general theory about how this shapes up at the moment, but I'm curious as to whether this taught you anything new.
It did not teach me anything new. Unfortunately, this confirms what I suspected would be the case. And there are two schools of thought on why this is. One school of thought is that people have always thought Trump was either shady or criminal, and this doesn't change their opinion of that. And then the other school of thought that I've read from a lot of people I respect is that Democrats aren't hammering at this hard enough. Is the Democrats need to talk about the conviction more, need to highlight the conviction more if we expect it to persuade anybody and matter to anybody. And then the argument would be that because the Democrats haven't really been doing that for the most part, that's why it is receding in people's minds. So I'm not sure. I know what I think, but I'm not 100% sure of what I think. What about you?
I think July 11th is going to be really important because if Trump gets prison time, I think it will matter. I think that 21% or whatever, I think that 21% of people who say that this matters to them is pretty important. Now, if those people then see the president get like a slap on the wrist or even probation, I think it will be a much harder argument to make. If they see him actually handed down prison time, I think it will make them very uncomfortable about pulling the lever for Trump. And I think this is important because I think there are two parts of it. One is like do you want to live in a country with a president who has a felony conviction and is staring down prison time? I think there's a way to message to those people to play on their patriotism and then their sense of decorum, which obviously hasn't gotten us too far. Although then again, Biden did beat Trump the last time around, and I do think a certain amount of people, I think at a certain point, couldn't really abide by Trump's behavior anymore. So I do think that there's this mythology out there that Trump is immune to these types of sentiments among voters, and I actually think that yes, it's not as much as we'd like, but I do think a pretty significant amount of voters do take note of Trump's behavior, and we'll get to some more data in a second that I think is pretty clear on that. I think the second part of this is just the chaos and just people saying, you know what, I just don't want the messiness of it. I'd rather have a guy who I might not think is necessarily the sharpest guy anymore and certainly isn't a spring chicken, but it's not going to be chaos. I know the right keeps trying to say there's chaos, and I watched an interesting Jon Stewart segment earlier today where he basically was going through the right wing sort of talking points on crime, where the FBI data is now out saying crime is dropping precipitously. And so the talking point now on all the right wing networks, including Fox, is people don't feel safe. And that's what's important, not the data itself. And this is what they're going to do. They're going to say, well, the economy is basically every indicator is heading in the right direction. Crime, every indicator is heading in the right direction. Maybe even immigration will be heading in the right direction after all these changes. But it's how people feel that matters, Jason.
It goes back to the old Stephen Colbert coined term of truthiness.
Yes.
It doesn't matter whether something is true. It matters whether it feels true. And so I think you're right. Um, I think it's unlikely that he gets sentenced to prison time, but I agree with you that if he does, it doesn't, to me, change people's minds because they're like, well, we can't have someone who's been sentenced to prison time. I think it's much more simple. And I think this is what you're getting at, which is that Americans are just going to be like, I don't know what happens if there's a president who might be in prison. Like, how can they? I think it just functionally, people are going to say, if he goes to, how can he be president? And it's a disqualifying logistical piece. It really, ironically, it is much more in the vertical, or like in the box of the way that they're trying, the Republicans are trying to disqualify Biden because of his age. It's actually sort of it's a more powerful disqualification by far, because it just makes people go, I don't see how he can do the job, right? It's almost as if, like, if he had a major health issue, right? So I think that would matter. I don't think it's super likely. I have noticed that the Biden campaign has lately been running ads and doing paid communication that lean more into the conviction. And that makes me think that their theory is that regardless of what polls say about people hypothetically in the past or now, like, realistically saying whether the news of the conviction affects their vote, that if you really message it to them and really make the choice that stark, that a lot of people will respond to it. And I think I said this last week that, you know, I still run into people who ask me things like at my work and others, like, well, who are the Republicans going to nominate? Because they haven't checked into the election yet. And a lot of regular everyday folks who will vote still don't haven't conceptualized the idea that it is going to be Trump again. So I think there might be something to that.
Yeah, so related piece of data here is Pew put out new data, and Axios helpfully sort of compiled it about this phenomenon of the double haters. So voters who have unfavorable views of both candidates. And this data is really fascinating. 25%, a full quarter of the electorate, has unfavorable views of both candidates. This is the most ever. To give you a sense, the first campaign that I remember was Bush versus Dukakis, which was 5%.
Mhm.
Amazingly, in 2020, same candidates, only 13% of voters were double haters. And I think that there are certain segments of this. Like, so for instance, there are a pretty significant segment of the left who are unhappy either about the Israel policy or think that Biden's too moderate, that I think are certainly in the double hater category. And then there's, like, I think significant percentage of independents or never Trump types. I think those people are up for grabs. I think the initial way to look at this is, well, what's the difference between the 13% in 2020 and the 25% now? I think Biden, you look at any numbers for Biden, he had a way higher favorability before. And I think the other for Trump is January 6th and this conviction. I think those two things have chipped away at his support. I think when I look at this, I say depressing, but huge opportunity. If there 25% of the electorate's unhappy, one of the two candidates could make a case to those folks.
Yeah, in normal times, you would look at any metric that expresses dissatisfaction with the status quo, whether it be, 25% of people hate both candidates, or the right track, wrong track, the approval of the current president, all those sort of things. And you would say that is an advantage to the challenger, which in this case is Trump. It probably is, at least in the polling as it is right now, it bears out as an advantage to Trump. And I think, whereas the last time where you had 13% of people hated both, that probably was an advantage to Biden. I mean, really, the biggest advantage to Biden last time was that Trump was president, and
Yes.
people were watching it going, this is going terribly. And now he's not president. And to some extent, well, not to some extent, to a great extent, Americans don't have the attention span that we used to have. And we are quick to forget how bad something was when it was bad. I mean, we don't have to go through the list, but I mean, I guess it would start with how COVID was handled, how, all sorts of different things. So that's obviously part of it. But I do think it does appear that of the people who hate both, that there may be a bit of a preference for Biden just through a simple sense of resignation, right? I mean, part of the article you're talking about says 67% of double haters believe Trump should end his campaign in the wake of his felony conviction. Now, that said, what they don't appear to have asked is something like, of these double haters, do you think Biden should even be running given his
Guaranteed
age?
that number is just as high.
That's what I think. I think it's even.
Because the majority of Democrats, the last time I looked at the data, felt Biden was too old to be running for president. So if that's just the Democrats, what is everybody else saying? I have somewhat controversial views on how they should handle this in general, like where we are right now. I was just listening to our friends at Pod Save America the other day, and they were talking about how they were having debates with, I forget who, this was a couple of weeks ago, about there was like a leaked story where the Biden folks were saying they're going to like acknowledge people's pain more and that the economy isn't perfect. And the Pod Save guys, I think, were generally for that strategy, but others were getting, like, I forget who, some other prominent critics were saying that's crazy. And I'm in the that's crazy category, not because I don't think like generally acknowledging pain is like stupid, but I think that and I don't mean this just from Biden. I think the entire Democratic apparatus, those of us who support him, need to forcefully push back on this narrative that the economy isn't going well, crime is going up. Like, we have to spend, I think, a majority of our efforts to tell the truth about what's going on in this country, because the right wing is doing everything possible to say that what is a historic recovery is not good. And I think Democrats have this sense that if there's anybody out there having pain in this economy, we need to be talking about that. And I'm like, yeah, in theory, yes, but you have only so much time. And this is actually an amazing recovery we have. Look at any other developed country in the world. The US is trouncing everybody right now. And this has been a very successful presidency. And I think we as a community need to put all effort into communicating to the American public what is actually in front of their face, because the right wing is doing everything they can to say that it's not a good economy, to say that crime is going up, to say that every indicator is bad when they're actually good. And I think we play into their hands if we devote too much oxygen to that. Like, I don't want the president to seem out of touch, but he's not out of touch if he says the economy is good. That's the thing, So I don't know. And I do think there's a difference between Biden and the rest of us too. Like,
right. I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's probably somewhere in the middle, because I don't think that you can go out there and cite studies and cite indicators and have it change the way people feel, because the truth is that it's not that people are wrong about the economy, it's that people aren't they aren't yet feeling the economic recovery. And look, I'm not an economist, but I think it's pretty clear that that has to do with the basic income inequality that is now just inherent to our system, and that needs to be changed. It needs to be changed through a lot of the policies that Biden wants to push. But as a result, when there are good economic indicators, when the economy does start to turn in a good direction, it takes longer than it used to take for regular folks to actually feel it. And so to me, it has to be a mix of the two. You have to go out and you have to demonstrate the progress in the economy. It's not enough to say, look at this indicator, look at that indicator. You have to highlight the examples of where things have gotten better. And then the message has to be, and I think this is somewhat already the campaign's message, you have to dovetail it with it. The message has to be about finish the job, their message, which it's basically, look, this is going well now. That is going well now. The rest of the country is going to start feeling this economic progress, but not if we go backwards, right? Like, to me, the argument is we are now finally on the precipice of all of us being able to feel this. We're rounding a corner, and it's working, and we're gaining speed, and Trump is going to take us right back. Like, to me, it's a more complicated, nuanced message where you can say, look, I understand that these great things that are happening aren't felt by everybody, but they're going to unless this guy gets back into office.
Yeah, and I think I'm looking at this Monmouth poll that you sent in. The last time I looked at this data, and this is somewhat contradicted by the Monmouth poll you sent, was that people had different perceptions of their own economic outlook versus the way things were generally going. Which, if that data holds, that's an opportunity, because that would really suggest that people are doing really well on a personal level, which is objectively true in most respects. There are certainly some blips there, and I think the lasting effect of inflation is one that we need to constantly keep our eye on. Right, like inflation could be slowing or going down, but the baked in inflation from past years is there, and that's always going to be something that's going to be a concern, and that's probably one of the reasons why inflation is at the top of everybody's list, including in that Monmouth poll. But I think the narrative of the Republicans are lying to you and they want to sow panic, which was essentially Jon Stewart's message, is such an important one, because it's almost a prophylactic against all the crazy shit they're about to do in this election. It's kind of what we did around the Bush period of time, right? Imperfectly, obviously, because we lost some of those races, but we knew coming into the Obama campaign that it was going to be a national security scare tactics election like 2004 was. And it was like, how can we do everything possible to inoculate the electorate against these types of panic arguments? And I think that this is something that Democrats need to do. And I think there's something about us where we're innately, as a party, sensitive to people's concerns. We're never satisfied with the way the economy is going. And in large part, I don't think we're really good at bragging about things like the kind of data that's here and the real improvements in people's lives. And it's, some of it is not like trivial, right? It's like the earned income tax credit, right? Child tax credit. These are things that have dramatically reduced extreme poverty in this country. And the last time we looked at data, which I think was a few months ago, like the amount of, first of all, wages going up, historically low unemployment, which is people having jobs and making more money, and at least from those studies in the fall, more money in their pocket than they've had before. Like these are like very tangible things, and I really hope that we can thread the needle in the months ahead, because heading into this Republican convention that they're gonna just basically lie to the American public about all this kind of stuff.
And I think you're right about the message of, look, they're lying to you. And I think that it dovetails with the overall message about Trump, right? The overall message, if you're just talking about Trump, the person in this election, and we've started to see a lot of this from Biden, and it's the right thing in order to describe Trump. It's just, look, the guy's just trying to stay out of prison, right? I mean, that's the basic sense. He's running not for you, but for himself. And if you can dovetail that with the economic message, it's the economy is improving. We are getting to where we're going to round a corner where more and more people are going to feel it. But this guy wants to talk the economy into a downturn. This guy is rooting against the economy because he thinks it's more likely to get him into the White House, which is more likely to keep him out of prison. So I do
and he'll
think
say
they
it.
go together.
He'll say it between now and the election. He'll essentially say that out loud if he hasn't said it already.
Oh, he's already said things about the economy. But it also dovetails with what he said about immigration, when he never said that the immigration bill was bad. He just said it would be bad in the election if it were passed now. Don't improve anything. So there is a real look at what he's doing with, what's his name, Evan Gershkovich. I can't remember his last name, but the reporter who's being held in Russia, who Trump has been back channeling to Putin, and is out and out saying, this guy is staying in prison until I'm elected. Putin's not going to, if Biden's still president, he's not going to let this guy out of prison. Like, the examples of Trump putting himself ahead of the country are numerous. But the problem is that in the past, those examples have not directly affected people's lives. Right. And that's what people vote on in a presidential election. Like, they look, 25% of people hate both candidates. And those people, if they're going to vote, are going to vote for somebody they hate, because they're going to vote for the person that they think is going to be most helpful to them or the things that they care about, which means your argument can't just be he's a bad guy who cares only about himself, because that's been the argument for years. And a lot of people either know that or know that that's our argument. It's got to be, he's a bad guy who cares only about himself, and you're getting hurt as a result. Here's how.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a super important difference.
Yeah, and there is a certain percentage of those people who may not vote at all, and some of those are dangerous for us, like the people who are mentioning who are unhappy with Biden over
Mm-hmm.
Israel or other issues. So that is a risk for us, you know?
It's why it goes back to what I keep saying. It feels like every week and on other programs too, which is that particularly with the double haters, because like anybody listening to this right now knows people in their life who say they're both bad. I can't believe these are our choices. And then, sometimes they're like, they're just going to vote for Trump because maybe they're angry about this or that, or they don't like woke or whatever. Or they've traditionally voted Republican, whatever it is. So you have to have something to say to those folks. And where I sound like a broken record is that the majority of voters, when you put Democratic policies versus Republican policies, right now in this moment in time, Democratic policies are winning more. It's why Democratic candidates are outperforming Biden. It's why every special election, every midterm, we keep doing so well. So
Yeah.
what my advice is, anybody who says I don't like either candidate, it's okay, fine. I am not here to convince you to vote for somebody that you don't like, or to like somebody that you tell me you don't like. Let's just talk about what is going to happen if one is elected versus the other, and not about their individual policies. I mean, I literally mean just say to them, let's just talk about Democrats and Republicans, because that is so counterintuitive to us, because we've had so many years, particularly the people who listen to this show, who live in places where they are one of the only progressives they know. And it's so counterintuitive because people are so used to trying to find this issue or that issue to bring people over to the other side, or trying to find the right candidate with the right profile to convince a Republican. And the truth is, right now on policy and on, R versus D, we have the momentum. So that's what you lean into. You're just like, here's what the Republicans are about right now. Here's what the Democrats are about right now. Just vote for Democrats, like including for president. Who cares whether you like both candidates?
Yeah.
And then make the argument about abortion and the economy improving and student loans. I mean, just today, Trump said that it was the worst thing in the world that Biden is trying to forgive student loans. I mean, anyway, I just think that continues to be the direction that you have to
I'd
go.
be curious, and maybe somebody in our audience knows where this data is, about data around the Supreme Court messaging, because I think this is a subset of what you're talking about, right? Like when people talk about what is probably the most potent issue and has been for the past few years, it's Dobbs, abortion, and then now I think by extension a larger conversation about the legitimacy and bias of this Supreme Court. I'd be curious to see how effective messaging around the court is, because I certainly know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that, where I've met personally plenty of people who voted Republican and voted Trump in 2016, not because they like the man, but because of the Supreme Court. And it would be interesting to see if a similar phenomenon could play out for Democrats. Yeah.
I'll take a step further. The message I'd like to see tested is not just Supreme Court choices because of issues like democracy and abortion, which is obvious, right? That there are voters who you're gonna target on the Supreme Court on those issues. I would like to see a lot more messaging on the Supreme Court on economic matters, because it's the Supreme Court that said no to student loan forgiveness. It's the Supreme Court that sides with corporations over and over and over again and screws unions and screws workers. So I'd be interested in seeing if you can't make a real difference on these economic arguments by saying, look, the Supreme Court is becoming more and more pro-corporation and anti-people who don't sign a paycheck but get a paycheck signed and issued to them, like people who work for a living. Every term it gets worse. And then the argument is, and do we want more pro-corporate justices or not? Or do we want to get back to a balance? Because I do think people have a real sense, and this is across the political spectrum, that they are getting screwed by the ever-increasing massing of corporate power. And interestingly, that also includes people who are upset about corporations, not just because of the economic reasons, but the people who think, the whole corporations are too woke, or, the big tech has too much influence. Well, if that's your concern, if you're an independent voter who's sort of in that Joe Rogan big tech has too much influence as colored by Josh Hawley's arguments, well, then you should care that it's an overwhelmingly corporate leaning Supreme Court and will only get more so under Trump.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, as we've talked about before, there's two things we need to do. One is we have to make it a choice, not a referendum on Biden. And number two is to go even further, if we can, to structure this so that we're running as the opposition and they're the incumbents, because they do control so many of the levers of power, including the Supreme Court, including Congress. And we're razor thin in the Senate, and it's almost assured that we're going to lose the Senate. So do you really want to hand more power to these people who keep taking away so many of your rights and handing power to corporations? That's
I would. What I would also say to people, there's people listening to this going, okay, these are some long-winded arguments you're expecting the Biden campaign to make to the American people. And I would just remind people, no, that's not what we do here. What we do here is we help listeners win over people, because that's the biggest way to make a difference.
Here's the one sentence. Vote. Do you want a court even more radically right-wing than this for the rest of your life? That's my one sentence. That's
for
it.
The rest of your life.
That is it.
Yeah.
That's what happens if we lose. They probably replace Alito and Thomas. That's it. For the rest of our lives, we're stuck with this court.
That's exactly right. And also, I just would remind people that, like, when you're having conversations with real people, you don't have to work in 30-second bits. Right. So it's okay to develop ideas a little more and have a conversation. That's what this show is all about. All right, let's change to a pretty different topic.
Let's actually hit our ads before we do that, if that's okay. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking we could do the North Korea piece, and then
okay, cool,
and then go to the ads, because then we're going to bring in Josh. So, all right, Vladimir Putin has just gone to North Korea to visit with Kim Jong-un, and they've announced this defense pact. They've announced, not unlike NATO, that they're going to have mutual defense of one another. That if North Korea is attacked, then Russia will defend, and if Russia is attacked, then North Korea will defend them. Now, this is, for the most part, formalizing what they've been denying has been happening anyway, because a lot of technology and a lot of arms have been flowing to Russia from North Korea to be used in the war in Ukraine. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because I have noticed lately that the right wing has been working overtime to mainline Russian propaganda into the basic, like, actual mainline or mainstream public debate in this country about the war in Ukraine. So it started obviously with the fight over whether to fund, whether to send aid to the war in Ukraine, to Ukraine or not. And it's continued. And now we're seeing, like, Tommy Tuberville go on and say, like, Putin didn't do anything wrong here, and just literally verbatim saying stuff that he's been given by Russian propaganda sources. So I wanted to bring this up to say, if there is any doubt about whether or not we can work with Russia, and whether this can be in our national security interest to have Russia take over Ukraine or win the war in Ukraine, we're talking about a country that is making a defense pact with North Korea. Like, I can't imagine a better example of an argument that says these are the bad guys. Like, he's like inviting Kim Jong-un to Moscow, and he's talking about what great friends they all are. And I don't think you can make it more clear.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of depressing. I was part of, while I was at the UN, I used to sit in these meetings. North Korea would test some satellite or something that was sort of a proxy for its nuclear program. We'd get together, we'd hash out some kind of resolution. The Russians and Chinese would inevitably try to weaken it, but they would inevitably support something. Like, we would get something through. I imagine that would not happen today. That they're just blatantly developing their program. Russia would veto any resolution against them.
It also demonstrates that the war in Ukraine and our backing of the war in Ukraine is weakening Russia. When Vladimir Putin has to turn around and go to North Korea for help and for assistance and for an ally, it's a funny analogy, but it's like when Donald Trump had to pick Mike Pence for vice president because nobody else wanted to be his running mate, right? And so, which demonstrated at that moment his weakness, right? It's his weakness, in the year after January 6th, before he, was able to sort of rehabilitate himself politically, when he was going and doing podcasts with the Proud Boys, and he was running out of allies. That's where Putin is now. We can't allow Putin to then recover from that. And obviously making Donald Trump president will do that. And where would I land this plane in terms of how people should make this argument? I would say it makes it a whole lot more likely that American sons and daughters will end up fighting in a war against Russian soldiers in Eastern Europe, which would be a very deadly war. And it would be extremely bad, could potentially become nuclear. And so this is why you have to have somebody who will not allow Putin to just continue to roll through Ukraine and possibly other parts of Europe.
All right. Well, let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to bring on a guest to talk about a subject near and dear to both of our hearts, especially yours, Jason, when we come back.
As you know, I am married with 2 kids, and so I've got a fair amount of responsibilities, and I always want to make sure that my family will have protection that fits our needs. So I'm grateful to have Policy Genius by my side. Policy Genius is the country's leading online insurance marketplace. It makes choosing the right policy for your family easy and quick. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options are 100% online and let you avoid unnecessary medical exams. Policy Genius helps you easily compare your options from America's top insurers in just a few clicks. Their award-winning agents can even walk you through the process step by step. Policy Genius has no incentive to recommend one insurer over another, so you can trust their guidance. Your work life insurance policy may not offer enough protection for your family's needs. Even worse, it may not come with you if you leave your job. Get peace of mind by finding the right life insurance with Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com/majority or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/majority.
As you know, I do a lot. I'm a podcaster. I'm a co-founder of a media company. I just started a company. Doing a lot, probably too much, but living a more heart-healthy life fuels everything I do. And we're introducing 3-in-1 blood pressure support plus CoQ10 from Super Beets Heart Chews Advanced. Paired with a healthy lifestyle, the grapeseed extract in Super Beets is clinically shown to be nearly 2 times more effective at promoting normal blood pressure than a healthy lifestyle alone. New Super Beets Heart Chews Advanced supports healthy CoQ10 levels, an important nutrient for heart health. Super Beets Heart Chews are incredibly delicious and so much better than any alternative supplements out there. I take these things throughout the day. I have them sitting on my counter, and I take them instead of candy, and they taste delicious. After taking my Super Beets Heart Chews, I just feel like I have more energy throughout the day. And CoQ10 generates 95% of cellular energy your heart needs, but it can decline with age, stress, and statin use. Super Beets Heart Chews Advanced is effective and contains clinically researched ingredients from Super Beets, the #1 doctor, pharmacist, and cardiologist recommended beet brand for cardiovascular health support. Find out how you can get a free 30-day supply on bundles with new Super Beets Heart Chews Advanced and save 15% for a limited time only by going to superbeetsradio.com, promo code majority. That's Superbeets, BEETS, radio.com, promo code majority.
All right, we were talking a few moments ago about the Supreme Court, and we're about to be joined by Professor Joshua Douglas. He teaches election and constitutional law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. He's written multiple books about voting rights, and his latest is The Court versus the Voters, the troubling story of how the Supreme Court has undermined voting rights. Josh, how you doing?
Hey, Jason. Great to see you.
We're glad you're here. Thanks for doing this. First, I guess, basic question. Start by telling us why you wanted to write this book, and then we'll talk more about the book.
Yeah, so my first book, which was called Vote for Us, was kind of a good news story of voting rights. It came out in 2019, and it was all about people on the ground in communities all over the country working on pro-voter policies, making our elections more democratic, more convenient. And so I kind of wanted to do that again since I had such great success. And I had this idea for the second book, what I was calling the Grand Election Compromise, where I was trying to come up with principles that we could all agree upon, Democrats, Republicans, everyone in between, as a starting place for our elections. And so I went to a trusted advisor and said, I have this idea, this Grand Election Compromise. And she said, that sounds great, but you need to explain the problem. Why do we need to have these sorts of compromises? And she said, can't the Supreme Court fix things? And I said, no, because the court has been terrible on voting rights. And she said, that's got to be the book. Explain to people why the Supreme Court has been so bad on protecting the right to vote. And then the Grand Election Compromise can be your conclusion. So that's where I started on trying to come up with a list of kind of the worst Supreme Court cases on voting rights and telling the stories of those cases to weave a narrative about how the Supreme Court has really harmed democracy.
Yeah, so give us an example of first some of those stories. I mean, I think people who listen to this program, watch this show, are probably pretty familiar with some of the boldface Supreme Court cases of the last several years. But what you do in the book is you dig in to how those cases came about, who it was that brought those cases, what they really mean. And so I'm curious about that. If you want to talk about, maybe pick one of those stories that sort of illustrates it, but also if you want to maybe detail for us a lesser known case that people are a lot less likely to know, but have a huge impact on how we got here on voting rights.
Absolutely. And you're right. The book has a handful of cases that listeners to this podcast probably have heard of, like Citizens United about campaign finance, or Bush v. Gore that ended the 2000 presidential election. And I tell the stories behind those cases as well. But a lesser known case and a really interesting story comes from a case called Burdick versus Takushi from 1992. I bet most people have never heard of this case. And it involves a guy in Hawaii, Alan Burdick, who wanted to write in a candidate. He went to the polls one day, didn't like any of the candidates that were for state representative. And he actually, as he told me, we tracked him down all these years later. He's still living in Hawaii, and I got to interview him for the book, which was fascinating. He's still angry about the case, actually. Mm-hmm. And so he went to the polls that day, and he said, I want to write in a candidate. And the poll worker said, well, the machine doesn't allow it. And he kind of half joked to me that he didn't know if it was the voting machine that wouldn't allow write-in votes or the political machine of Hawaii politics that didn't want dissent in, if someone writing in a candidate that wasn't one of the established ones. So he ended up suing and bringing the case all the way to the Supreme Court. I really think this case is interesting also because this is not what we sometimes refer to as cause litigation, where some lawyers want to challenge a particular rule and they go out and find a plaintiff who can bring that challenge. This was just a guy who was frustrated by the fact that he wanted to express himself in a particular way through voting, and the law wouldn't let him do it. The case had various stops in the court system. It went to the Hawaii Supreme Court and then the federal courts, ultimately ended up at the U.S. Supreme Court. And during the oral argument in that case, one of the justices asked his lawyer, well, are you saying that your client should be allowed to write in Donald Duck for an office? And his lawyer said, well, yeah, if that's, a protest vote, then that should be allowed. Alan told me he's really frustrated by this answer. He didn't think it was the right answer that his lawyer gave because he feels like that minimizes the power of write-in voting. He thinks it's a very serious outlet. And why is this case so important? Well, it's been cited hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times. It's taught in every law school in the country, which again really surprised Alan Burdick, because what the court in the case did is not only did they uphold Hawaii's law that allows, them to ban write-in voting. Maybe that's not that big of a deal. But what it said was that when analyzing a voting rule, we're essentially going to trust the state. We're going to defer to the state's rules on how to run an election. We've seen that a ton now, but the foundation for it was laid in this 1992 case where instead of the voters being paramount, essentially it's the state politicians who craft the laws who are the ones that have the best rights in this analysis. And of course, those are the people we should trust the least.
Go ahead.
From a political perspective, I vaguely remember just a few months ago reading articles about, whether it's Stephen Miller or others, like members of sort of Trump's circle building pretty sizable legal operations to lay groundwork ahead of this election for a favorable environment. And I'm just curious to see if you've been tracking that sort of larger effort and whether you've seen any fruits of that for the right. Like, because obviously they were super unsuccessful challenging the 2020 election after it happened. I think they basically lost every single case. But have they been succeeding around the country before this election, getting a favorable environment?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to think about that. On the one hand, the court and the Supreme Court and the federal courts did essentially uphold democracy by rejecting the Trump challenges after 2020. And, that was good for democracy. It's sort of the lowest hanging fruit. I mean, if we're celebrating the court for, not overthrowing democracy, that's a pretty low bar. But they did that, which I think goes to show that the court is not going to go to the extremes. And we see this in some of the other cases on Voting Rights Act and otherwise, where the court will chip away at various rules as opposed to going to the extremes. So in answer to your question, that's exactly what's happening in my view, is that you have a variety of cases, whether it's about partisan gerrymandering and the drawing of maps, whether it's about protection for minority voters and the ability to use the Voting Rights Act, on things like, states limiting the number of drop boxes that are allowed. In a state like Georgia has a rule that it looks neutral on its face, but of course what it means is that there's only one drop box or a few drop boxes in an urban area of Atlanta. Ohio has the same kind of rule where Ohio law says only one drop box for delivering a ballot per county. Of course, not all counties are equal in the state of Ohio. And what the cases have done, what the court has done, is allowed these laws to kind of stay in force, again, deferring to the politicians and how they craft the voting rules. And so in terms of an environment of challenging, let's say, we have a repeat of 2020 and Trump loses, but he challenges the results. I don't think the courts are going to overturn democracy again if it's pretty clear who the certified winner is in enough states to comprise an electoral college majority. But what has been successful is laying the foundation to make it harder and harder for people to participate, to make it harder to challenge voting rules and easier to have courts uphold the voting regime and not question the way in which the process is occurring. So I think the inputs going into the election are what's concerning and where there has been success in creating an environment where it's really hard now to challenge state voting rules, even if there's really strong evidence that the law will make it harder for people to participate and create an unfair system.
Josh, is it that the Supreme Court is unwilling to go so far as to overturn democracy, or is it that the Supreme Court is unwilling to be directly responsible for doing it? I ask it this way because what I'm envisioning is it may not be a scenario where the court is in a position to invalidate an election with a single decision, but it might be a scenario where the court is able to remand a decision or defer a decision to a political body. Like, let's say there's something they can do that lands the presidential election in the House of Representatives, or something that removes the direct and immediate responsibility from them, but they would know they are the but-for cause that democracy is overturned. Like, that feels possible to me and scary.
Yeah, I agree that feels possible, and I think this court. And when we talk about the court, we're talking about the conservative majority. But even within the conservative majority, you've got kind of different factions, right? And right now, you still have the Chief Justice John Roberts, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett faction, which cares about the court's institutional legitimacy. I think the other three conservatives, Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, and to some extent Brett Kavanaugh care less about the way in which the public is viewing the court and the court's legitimacy. Certainly, Chief Justice John Roberts does care about the court's legitimacy. So, that's where I say, for example, in the cases about the Voting Rights Act, where the court didn't explicitly overturn a key provision recently, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, it did, chip away or set rules that could undermine its efficacy. In terms of what you're talking about, I think that's absolutely right. The court, and that's a trend line through all of the cases I discuss in the book and other cases, is that the court is saying we want to stay out of this and we just want to let this be leave this to the political branches. Well, of course, that's a decision to say, we're not going to decide in partisan gerrymandering or in a disputed presidential election. That itself is a decision. The decision not to decide is a decision. And if we know that the other branches are not going to uphold democracy, we would want the court to be the one, as an independent arbiter of the Constitution, to step in. So I think you're right that is also a major concern. We have so many different attacks on the democratic system, and the court is one of them. It's one that we don't talk about enough, except for one-off cases here or there. But it's also part of the whole institutional design that I think is failing us in many ways and primed to potentially fail us even further.
Yeah, it's like they say, like, well, we're not committing arson. We just handed, gasoline and a match to a known arsonist. But what the arsonist does has nothing to do with us. We cannot be held responsible. We're elite legal minds. I mean,
it's trying to stay.
They know what the
fray.
result's going to be when they do this.
Well, and this is an example of what the court has done a ton in a lot of these cases. Take the Shelby County case, which many people know about or have heard of, about Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, this provision that southern states had to seek pre-approval for voting laws to ensure that there wasn't discrimination. And the court actually didn't strike down Section 5 in Shelby County. It struck down a different provision, Section 4, that was the coverage formula, the mathematical formula to determine which states were subject to this pre-approval requirement. And the court said, well, we're not striking down Section 5. This idea that some places with a history of discrimination might have to seek pre-approval still lives on if you could create a new coverage formula. Of course, everybody knew that would never happen, right? The Congress is not going to do that. And, I think about Justice Ginsburg's dissent in that case, in which she said, throwing out this coverage formula is like throwing out your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And that's such an apt analogy here of what you just noted and what the court has done. It is trying to be, or at least seem like it's being incremental. But I think we need to call the court out for what it's doing. It's not, even though it pretends to be incremental, the decisions are not in terms of the results, the real world practical results of what's happening on the ground.
Okay, before we go to your sort of grand election compromise idea, I did want to ask you to run through. It seems one of the sort of running theories of the book, or arguments of the book, is that our conception of where the Supreme Court has been on issues of democracy is not really right historically, because the way we tend to look at it is we tend to think that the court would, for a long period of time, stood between authoritarian tendencies and democracy, and kind of was a bouncer to keep democracy safe. And now we're going backwards on that. We certainly are going backwards on that. But it seems that one of your arguments is that if you look at the court over time, over the full scope of time, it has actually really not been a great friend to democracy, and that the burden on the rest of the country, on the other institutions, is much greater than we realize to defend democracy.
Yeah, I mean, so the court over and over again until the 1960s had rejected claims of expanding the franchise. There's a relatively early case called Minor versus Happersett in, I forget the exact year, late 1800s or early 1900s, where this is a challenge to essentially allowing women to vote under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, right? The idea that, well, after the Civil War, the Constitution included a new provision that requires equality, and denying the right to vote to women, it denies that idea. And the court said, no, there's no right to vote for women within the Equal Protection Clause that required the passage of the 19th Amendment. Of course, the court was no friend to people of color with respect to granting voting rights, and it really only took both some cases in the 1960s and both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two federal laws that helped to break down the various barriers. But then in the 1960s, we actually had, I think, some meaningful progress when it came to the way in which the court thought about voting rights. It recognized the right to vote, even though it's not listed explicitly in the U.S. Constitution, something that I think surprises many people. But the U.S. Constitution does not explicitly confer the right to vote. It does talk about it in the negative. It says states can't deny the right to vote on the basis of various characteristics, sex, race, etc. But the court in the 1960s did recognize the right to vote. And then in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, you start seeing this pullback of protection. And again, this deferral of voting rules to state politicians, the foxes guarding the hen houses idea. And I think many people today think of the court as, it's just the recent court that's been harmful on voting rights. Today's court is harmful because of the foundation set in those cases in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. But if you look at the long arc of the court, it has not been, protective of voting rights. There's another early case in which the court said, basically, we're going to stay out of it. Decisions about politics, lawsuits about the way to run elections are too political in nature for the court. But as I mentioned before, staying out of it is itself a decision, upholding the status quo of the state politicians. So, my book looks at, I don't go too much before the 1960s. I talk about kind of how we were at the high water mark in the 1960s, and things have declined, but in a way that I think people haven't fully grasped and understood, in part because, that case I mentioned before, the 1992 case about the guy in Hawaii, Burdick, that case, I don't think people really paid attention to in 1992. And it's only when we take a look back and we see the connective tissue among all of these cases do we begin to grasp the way in which voters are not the most paramount. We think of voters as the paramount actor in a democracy, but the court doesn't think so, and it hasn't thought so for a pretty long time.
Okay, before I have you talk about the Grand Election Compromise, which is where we'll conclude this, I want to tell you my own skepticism about these compromises so that you can address it as you go. And that is based on the fact that I tend to think that the conservative justices view corporations as people and black people as 3/5 of a corporation. And so part and parcel of that is that whenever, like when I was Secretary of State, whenever people would come to me with an idea that was sort of a compromise between the folks who want to expand the franchise and the folks who are concerned about fraud, what always got me about it was that I don't really believe that the interests that are concerned about fraud are concerned about fraud. I think that they're concerned about people voting, and in particular, people of color. And so that's why I've always had so much skepticism over the idea of trying to compromise with people who are being disingenuous. So with that said, rather than ambush you and say that after you say your compromise, I wanted to say that so you can speak to that as you explain sort of the grand compromise idea.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Before I do that, just because you mentioned the corporations are people aspect, I do want to note that in the chapter that about Citizens United, I begin with the story about how a corporation actually ran for office. It's a pretty hilarious tale. It goes out of Maryland where a corporation said, hey, if they're trying to push the limits, but they said, hey, if the Supreme Court says they can spend money on politics, why can't they just run for office? So they actually filed to run for office for Congress. They filed to run for Congress. Murray Hill Incorporated. They had a great ad.
Cool.
It was a fun story. And I got to interview the guy who is behind that. Okay, so the grand election compromise that I discuss in the book, and taking some of your skepticism in mind. Well, I don't think this is going to convince the Supreme Court. The goal here is to avoid the court by creating rules that kind of everyone basically agrees are good. And we had some success in Kentucky. Kentucky was a national story of positive voting rules during the pandemic, where we passed laws that were bipartisan in nature that kind of everyone agreed were the right approach. I was lucky to be in the room, the so-called room where it happens, for some of the discussions about these. So I've seen this work. And the other thing is, this grand election compromise is at a pretty general level. So what is it? It's 4 principles that I think should be the starting place for any conversations about how we run our elections. And the 4 principles are: every eligible voter should have easy access to the ballot. The system should be set up to deter fraud. Voters should be well educated. And 4th, the losing candidates should graciously accept defeat. And I think if we have those 4 as our starting place, then any proposed law has to go through the ideas behind them to ask, okay, does it achieve one of these goals? If it achieves none of them, then the law should be rejected. If they are if they violate one of them, the law should be rejected. So every proposed law should achieve at least one of those goals and not violate any of them. And again, we saw this work in Kentucky. Now, I think courts could adopt it to say, look, again, if a law is challenged and it doesn't satisfy one of the principles, or it violates one of the principles, then we should reject the law. But more so, it's about how we have the conversations, the starting conversations. And yeah, they're at a high level of generality, but I think that's where we have to go. And you can pair things. In Kentucky, we paired, early voting with stronger checks of the voting process. We have a very mild photo ID law with expanded ability to request a absentee ballot by online, a vote by mail online. So, and we don't have the greatest election rules in Kentucky. I'm not arguing that at all. We have a ways to go on various rules, but we did find, the secret sauce, or maybe the secret bourbon, to have some compromise in voting rules, because we were trying to think about what kinds of laws achieve the dual goals of access and so-called integrity problems and not violate any one of those ideas. Did I change your skepticism at all, or?
You made me feel much better about Kentucky. And because I will tell you, like in Missouri, when I was approached with like a similar compromise, the Republican I was working with, who I actually approached him the first time, and he was like, he was like a pro-democracy Republican who I think now may quietly be a Democrat, and now that he's no longer in office. But what I vividly recall is him saying, look, I like your idea. The problem is the guys on my side of the aisle, they're not looking for an element of the compromise that deters fraud. They're looking for an element of the compromise that deters Black people from voting. So he was like, so unless we're talking about something that has real teeth to it and actually makes it harder for people to vote, not something that makes it harder to cheat, but he's like, then they're just not going to go there with you. And so but I am buoyed by the idea that there are elected Republicans who, in a place like Kentucky, who have actually so bought into the idea that fraud is a real concern that they're willing to make compromises in order to get things that would actually stop fraud that's not happening. That makes me feel better.
And of course, the politics are different too, right? So, we have the right politics where the Republicans aren't really concerned that much about losing most elections, except for the gubernatorial election here.
I think that's a good point. So, okay, with that said, before we go, plug your book one last time.
Yeah, so it's The Court versus the Voters, the troubling story of how the Supreme Court has undermined voting rights. It's available in all the places. Of course, I like promoting local bookstores. It has some great reviews. I'm really flattered by the reception. And the last thing I'll say is that someone put it on a list of beach reads for the summer if you want to read a book about elections. So I worked really hard to make it accessible to tell lots of stories. It's just a book of stories and with a little law just snuck in, but mostly stories. And I tried to make it as readable as possible. And the reviews so far have suggested that that's been a success. So I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, all the reviews absolutely praise you for a book that takes law and makes it where anybody can understand it and enjoy it. So I commend you on that. That's super hard to do. So thank you, Josh, for joining us. Everybody, please leave a 5-star review, just like we always ask you to do. You can find me at Jason Kander on everything. You can find Ravi at Ravi M. Gupta. Josh, where can they find you?
Douglas and JoshuaADouglas.com.
All right. So thank you to the Meidas Mighty. Remember, we all have a platform. Make sure to use yours today.